you, Zadok. I also want to give a special welcome to Adam and Paulina, somewhere. Yes, so good that you're here. It's such a blessing. And Adam told me that he has just finished his PhD in chemistry. That has got to be a huge success and a great blessing and great credit to both of them, because it sure does take a toll on the family, and it's a huge project. And just ask that the Lord would greatly bless you guys going forward in a new phase of life now. It's wonderful. We're going to be turning today to Ecclesiastes, or Qohelet, chapter 11. But before we do so, I have a couple things I wanted to bring up. And so on the PowerPoint that we're going to have in a sec, there we go, it's coming. I just want to show you a picture of the Torah scroll that we have ordered and that has arrived. It's currently in Lions Bay and in good keeping, good care. It should be safe there. But I wanted you to see the Torah scroll and make a couple comments. The scroll, as it is rolled up, is on the left. There you can see the scroll on the right, with its wrapping, with its cover taken off. And on the next slide, I thought it was important for you to see the quality. Although we did not pay a fortune for the scroll, it appears to be from the photograph, and it's a reputable seller who doesn't just take pictures of the good pages and ignore the bad. You can see that the daf here, the page, is quite clear and legible. Now, in Jewish tradition, there is a kosher scroll, and a scribe can certify a scroll as kosher. In other words, it's in top notch. There's not one letter malformed or obscured or rubbed out in the whole scroll. We are not in that bracket where we're about to spend $30,000 to $50,000 for a kosher scroll. But this is a very serviceable scroll, and we're really pleased that Dorothy Coles left us a small, well, not too small, a significant legacy by which we were able to purchase this and remember her by. She is a prayer warrior who prayed for the Jewish people and for Israel for many, many years. Mr. Stone and Johanna and others can attest. And so, a wonderful sister. On the next slide, there is, we'll see, there we go, more close-up on the script. I'm actually really impressed and looking forward to seeing the Torah scroll, which we hopefully will have with us next week, Mr. Stone, so that we can actually bring the Torah into service during Sukkot. Because it is at the end of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, that it is traditional to roll the scroll right back to the beginning. It has the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It has the 5 books of Moses in it, and we roll it back to the beginning, and then we begin our reading through the Torah for the year. Its first official use will probably be at Ben's bar mitzvah, Ben Lyman. And so we're really looking forward to that, and that will, please God, Ben tells me it'll happen sometime in October. I think that has a lot to do with his parents. They'll have to set a date with him and with us, and we'll have a great celebration. We're hoping that the downstairs room will be available, and we'll actually be able to have at least some kind of a nosh and fellowship together after that to celebrate and rejoice. And forewarning, it's traditional to bring the bar mitzvah boy or bat mitzvah girl a gift, which usually goes into their college fund for when they go to university later on. But that's something we'll be doing for our young man Ben, who will be then stepping up to the plate as a man in the Jewish tradition. On the next slide, and this is the next thing that we need to consider, when you have a Torah, you have to have a box for it. The Hebrew word for box is aron, or in this case, it is aron. We call this the Aron Kodesh, the holy box. The Aron Kodesh is where we keep a Torah scroll. And it's very important to have one, both to protect the scroll, and also during the service it is opened and closed at various points during the service as is appropriate. So we'll probably put the Aron Kodesh right here, and here we are. This is a picture of the Aron Kodesh in a congregation that I know in South Seattle, near the Seattle airport. And they have a really fancy one. I don't think we can even think of competing with this. If you went and saw it, it's much more impressive in person. And maybe at some point, if you're down there, once all the restrictions are lifted, you'll get to attend one of their services someday. But here is another one. This is a portable Aron Kodesh. And this is much more like something that we would use, because what we would do is we would keep we would put handles on the side, so we could just carry it into the room that we have on the side here, where we have a little bit of storage space, and we would be able to bring it out and put it back every Shabbat. That's probably still a little bit beyond us. The problem with that is it takes time to build, and we're in a bit of a rush, and we also need a volunteer, someone who likes working with wood, with furniture, who would either take a cabinet from a used a used furniture store like on Main Street or something, and modify it to make a Aron Kodesh, or would build one from scratch for that. But the other option is quite doable and quite practical, and this is the really portable version. It's IKEA, and you take that box, and then on the next slide you just get a little pedestal, also from IKEA. Oh, there's nothing there. Okay, but then you have an Aron Kodesh that is quite functional. All you have to do is put a curtain inside and a couple holders to hold the scroll in place, and you're in good shape. So God willing, within a couple of weeks, we'll have that in place as well. So I wanted to let you know the direction in which we're heading, and I think it'll really enhance our worship. It also is something that, as I've mentioned before, Jewish people will expect when they walk into a place of worship and they look at the front. They probably won't be surprised to see anything that's up there, but people will expect to see an Aron Kodesh that has in it a Torah scroll. It's that first step through the door. It's those first impressions that affirms to people that this is truly a place for Jewish people to worship. And so that is part of the reason why we are getting a Torah scroll, and why we're going to incorporate it in our services. And just one final note, every month we have a routine. The last Shabbat of every month, we say a prayer for the coming month. As you know, Richard generally led us in that prayer. Then on the first Shabbat of every month, we generally have Seudat Adon, or the Lord's table, or as I call it more often nowadays, Zichron Mashiach, remembrance of Messiah. But what the plan is that I'm suggesting, and I'm looking for feedback on, is that then the second Shabbat of every month, we would have a Torah service, where we have a Torah reading, a Devar Torah, a word on the Torah, and we would have that more traditional service. And so really every Shabbat of the month would be a little bit different, because we have our regular service last service of the month, first service of the month, and second. And that also should help to mix things up a little and keep things interesting. Now that we've got through that, we are now at the last bit of our study on the 5 Megillot. I can't remember exactly when we started, but it was a bit less than a year ago, going through the 5 Megillot. The 5 Megillas that are 5 scrolls that are read in the synagogue during the year. And if you remember, we started with Purim, and we read the book of Esther. That is always read at Purim. Then we went from the book of Esther, and we started reading the Song of Songs. That is what is read at Passover. And so I wanted to quickly review where we've been and where we're going, and where, as much as possible, we have seen Messiah in these books, because Messiah is in all Scripture, either directly or in a hidden way. And so the first of the books, Esther, is that book about Purim, by which we know that if God had not intervened with our people in Shushan, as he did in that day, our people would have been destroyed, because the Persian Empire governed the entire known world where Jewish people lived, and there was a decree against us that we should be destroyed. God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, but nevertheless, God is clearly there. And the messianic significance is clear, because it is that turning event that says, in the midst of everything that has happened, we have been exiled from our land and from the city of Jerusalem. We were suffering, still in bondage, even if Esther is written at a time where some had returned to the land. That land was under the Persian Empire, and we had our enemies who were more than happy and willing and waiting for the opportunity to destroy us. But God intervened, not just for the sake of Israel, but for the sake of the entire world, that the Jewish people should be preserved, because it was essential that the Jewish people should be preserved so that the words of the prophets might come to pass, and that in the city of David might be born he who is to be ruler over all Israel. So it's an amazing event, it's an amazing story, and reminds us of not just this event, but so many times over history where God has miraculously preserved the Jewish people, again, not just for our sake alone, but for the sake of the entire world. There is still coming the day when Yeshua will sit on his throne, ruling his people in Jerusalem, when there will be 144,000 proclaiming the news of Yeshua to the world, and when he will reign, and Israel will be part of Messiah's reign over all the earth. It's going to be an exciting day. The next, this tells us just basically the timeline of what happened with when Esther happened. But then the next song, the next book, the Song of Solomon, is read as we approach Pesach. And as we, let's go back to Song of Solomon.
No, there is no.
Maybe it's out of order. Anyway, the Song of Solomon tells us of God's love for Israel. And it reminds us of that and prepares us to understand God's love for us. It is a love story. It's clearly literal, but it also very clearly has more than a literal meaning, and should and does speak to us. So there we have the Song of Songs. Then for Shavuot. Shavuot comes after Pesach. For Shavuot, we read the book of Ruth. And in the book of Ruth, again, we don't see a clear prediction of Messiah or anything like that. But on the other hand, it's very clear that here is God doing something remarkable and miraculous in the life of Israel and in the life of the nations around. He brings in a nation that has been condemned and for which Israel is not to have anything to do with forever. And he brings a woman out of that nation, and she comes into Israel at Shavuot, at the spring harvest. And in Israel, she becomes one of the people. She says, my people will be your people, your God will be my God. She is an example of one from the nations, no matter how far that nation might be from God, who has come and who has turned to him, and then not only is she accepted, but in reality, this woman becomes an ancestress of Yeshua HaMashiach. What an amazing story of God's grace and God's mercy to each one of us. I know there's been once in a while, and I've experienced this probably over 20 or 30 years since the Messianic movement began. Sometimes there are those who are not Jewish who feel, hey, I'm in the Messianic movement, but I feel like I'm second class, like I'm being treated, or like I feel like I'm second class. But that's not God's way at all. God has not only brought in the stranger, but it is a full welcoming in. Before God, we are all equal. Kehillath, Tsion, as any Messianic congregation, has been formed specifically as a place where Jewish traditions are observed and where Jewish people hopefully can find a home and feel at home. That's to help us, partly so that our people might have removed for them all those obstacles that keep us from the Messiah. I was really thrilled to see on Yom Kippur a couple different people who are unbelievers who came, an Israeli unbeliever, who came and prayed with us on Yom Kippur. It was exactly what we are here for. We are a place where people can come and where they can worship the Lord in a place that is familiar, but also where we can worship the Lord and His Son, Yeshua HaMashiach, and proclaim Him to those who come and visit with us. So here is Ruth, brought into the very family of Messiah. Now, while I'm talking, my memory's glitching. So after this song, yes, then we come to Echa. Thank you. Following this, there is a non-biblical holiday. It is called Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And as you will remember, we finished the book of Echa, which is a book of weeping. It is a book of crying from Jeremiah the prophet as he witnesses the destruction that Jerusalem is undergoing under the armies of the Babylonians. Destruction of cities in those days was not a momentary affair. Now, as happened in Europe, people send over a fleet of bombers and a city like Dresden can be absolutely destroyed in a matter of hours. Now it's even quicker, as happened at Hiroshima and elsewhere. Tragically. We look at that, but then we also realize in those days, destruction of a city took a lot of work. It took a lot of time. The soldiers would be hard at work for days and months, working themselves, enslaving the population as well to destroy that city and to tear it down stone by stone. Jeremiah witnessed that. He weeps and he cries over Jerusalem. This book is read at Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the day on which we remember the destruction of the first temple on that very day. And we remember the destruction of the second temple, and even more so, we even remember after Bar Kokhba's revolt, some 65 years after that, that revolt came to an end just days after Tisha B'Av. Many tragedies have befallen the Jewish people on that day and at that time of year. So we remember Jerusalem. And as we say in the Jewish prayers, we pray for the restoration of Jerusalem and worship there so that we might be able to worship the Lord as in days of old. It is always our prayer that we should be one day able to worship there. I think all of us have seen the backdrop that we purchased a few years ago of the Qohelet. And you can see that even to this day we are in a position of humiliation, only able to worship at the Qohelet facing the Temple Mount, where the temple once stood. The way is not open for the temple to be rebuilt, and probably will not be in our lifetimes. And when it does happen, it will be a sign that we are in the very, very, very end of days, and the Lord is coming very, very soon. But nevertheless, we mourn that situation, and we mourn our own sins that brought us to that point. And so now, lastly, we are in Qohelet. Qohelet, that is the root word for Kehillath, that is the root word for ecclesia, which is where we get the word Ecclesiastes in English. This is the book that speaks about life. And this book is read at Sukkot, where we celebrate living with God in our presence. And on Sukkot, as we celebrate it, and we actually just have a couple days to build our sukkahs, if you're going to build one, needs to be built very shortly. But we celebrate in that sukkah, in that temporary structure, God's dwelling with us in a temporary structure in the wilderness for 40 years. God not only put us wandering in the wilderness in tents, but He joined us. He went camping with us. And camping's fine for a couple nights, but after a while, all the rocks under your bed, under your sleeping bag, get a little bit old. 40 years is a long time, but the Lord was with Israel in the pillar of fire, in the pillar of cloud, day by day. And so on Sukkot, we remember God's presence with us. And we remember and look forward to the day when Messiah will be present with us once again. So what does Ecclesiastes tell us about living then? This book that we read on that festival, which is all about God living with us. And we've come to the last 2 chapters, and we just have a few minutes left, but I think it's enough to really warm our hearts. Because so many times people come to this book and they don't get it, and think, boy, this book is so sober, so sobering, and so sad, and so pessimistic about life. But in reality, that is not the purpose of Solomon the king, here at all. His purpose is to give us hope. His purpose is to show us the way in which we really might live. And he says right from the beginning, if anyone knows how to live, I'm the guy. I've got all the money I want, I've got all the women I want, I've got all the wine I want, I've got all the power, I've got all the wisdom I want. But with all of that, what is it? He says, there's a better way. We often say this ourselves, money doesn't buy happiness. That's a saying we say, but Solomon really had experienced that. He had every reason by human thinking to be a pretty happy guy. But he said, no, that's not going to do it. Wisdom is given in Qohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 11 and verse 1. Cast your bread on the waters, for after many days you will find it. Give portions to 7 or even 8, for you don't know what disaster may happen on the earth. Here is Solomon in something that actually we refer to when we do Tashlich on Rosh Hashanah. When we go to a river and we cast our stones or coins or bread, whatever is in our pockets, into the river in order to symbolize our rejection and getting rid of our sins as we approach God. He says, cast your bread on the waters. It reminds us of what the Lord said, lay up your treasures in heaven. Cast your bread on the waters. After many days you will find it. It will come back. When I was young, people used to say, what goes around comes around. I don't know if people are still saying that or if I'm dating myself. But it is certainly an act of doing something good. Throwing your bread on the waters. One Jewish interpretation is that this is doing goodness and kindness to a person about whom you know or suspect. You may never see that person again, but you do them good. You might have seen those bumper stickers, saying do random acts of kindness and I forget how the phrase goes. But nevertheless, this is something that we do for others. Give portions to 7 or even 8 as people being generous with people around you, because you don't know what will happen in the future. The days may yet come and that we receive recompense, and we are going to need those that we have made friends of. We're told to sow because we need to be ready to weep. It's actually to reap. It's actually a theme of this chapter. So Solomon gives this advice: be generous. Throw your bread on the waters. You don't know, you know what happens when you throw bread in the water. He knows it. It dissolves. The fish eat it. It's kind of gone really quick. You don't see it again. But he says, do that. You can't count on it coming back, but it's going to come back in some way. And what's the basis? He'll give you a reason for the basis soon. He says in verse 3, if the clouds are full, they empty out rain upon the earth. We all know that, especially yesterday. It was a very rainy day. The clouds are full, they empty out rain on the earth. Things happen inevitably. When we see big dark clouds coming and they pile against Grouse Mountain, especially if you're a North fan, it's gonna rain. Whether a tree falls to the south or the north, where it falls, it lies. It just lies where it falls. Things happen inevitably. Life goes on. You're not going to be able to change those things. So he says, whoever keeps watching the wind, you're not going to be able to control the wind. You're not going to be able to control life. You need to keep doing what is right. When you're sowing, if you've ever done sowing, not seed by seed in the soil, but when you're spreading seed, depending on what you want to do, you're either going to want it to be a little bit breezy to catch the seed and help it to spread, if you're, say, planting a lawn, and disperse the seed. Or maybe you don't want it to be windy at all because you don't want that wind to blow the seed onto the flower bed next to where your lawn is, because you're going to be digging up grass for the next 5 years if it does. And he says, don't be there waiting for the perfect opportunity. Do what you need to do now, and you will see the results. Whoever gazes at the clouds will not reap. You need to be diligent. This is exactly what we see as happens with the apostles after Yeshua rose from the dead. They get about doing the Lord's business quickly. They're not waiting for the perfect opportunity. He gives us more advice about how we don't know how things, what is going on in our world. We cannot control. the work. Just as you do not know how the Spirit passes into the bones in the womb of a pregnant woman, so you do not know the work of God, who makes all things. We need to be about God's business. He says in verse 6, sow your seed, and in the evening do not let your hand be idle. It's good advice to us. And right now, this is what we call wisdom in the Bible. Wisdom literature, it's advice on how to live your life. So we can look at it. We can look at verse 5, and if you think about how the Spirit passes into the bones of a fetus, it's a miracle. I'm told that by the time you reach 7 weeks from conception, the egg has not only implanted itself in the womb, but every single bone, your entire skeleton, has been laid out at 7 weeks. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing sign of God's power. As King David said, our bones are mysteriously, miraculously made. We are knit together in our mother's womb. He says, you don't know the work of God, who makes all things. Our God is in control of all. Therefore, since you cannot control, and I'm trying to make sense of this for all of us, since you can't control when the clouds come and drop their rain, you can't control where a tree falls, and where it falls, it stays. This is all out of our control. We can't control the miraculous process of conception and birth and development. All these things are beyond us. And then he says, be diligent. Don't let your hand be idle, for you don't know, verse 6, if this or that will succeed, or if both will prosper together, morning or evening. So sow your seed in the morning, sow your seed in the evening. Don't necessarily wait for the perfect time. I've got a friend, Mark Sarah. He's an Iranian Jew, a believer in Yeshua, who likes to say, fortune favors the brave. And there's a lot of truth in that. Solomon continues, though, and this does begin to speak more and more to our hearts, not just our behavior. Verses 7 to 10. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. For if a man lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember for the days of darkness, for there will be many, many days of darkness. Everything to come is obscure. He says, rejoice, young man, in your childhood, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know for all these things God will bring you into judgment. And so basically he's saying, sure, you can go and you can live your life, you can enjoy it, you can do what you want. But remember, there is a God. Remember that God is going to judge all that we have done. So banish anxiety from your heart, cast off distress from your body, for youth and prime of life are fleeting. And then there is no chapter division in Qohelet. The chapter divisions are later. He says, so, as a result, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. In other words, he is telling us, he's been giving us in the last few verses about rejoicing, enjoying yourself, life is fleeting, all that stuff. He's been telling us that, saying, sure, go ahead, but remember you're going to be judged. But then he says, but remember your Creator. This is what you really need to do. And each one of us, sure, life is there for the taking. We are to enjoy life, but we must remember our Creator before the days of misery come and years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Those days are coming. Youth and prime of life are fleeting. Those days come for all of us. Before the sun and light and moon and the stars grow dark, and this I had Mr. Stone read, so I don't have to read it all, because it really is a little bit gloomy. And Mr. Stone's probably wondering why I had him read this section this morning. But there are all these pictures and images about the time when the chirps of the birds and all their songs grow faint. And we realize he's now painting this black picture. This picture of when the silver cord will be broken. One rabbinical interpretation of that phrase is like what happens to our spines when we get old. They get very fragile and we have back problems. Everyone has back problems at some point, but they get worse and worse. And they say, you know, before all of this happens, remember God, because we and our spirit return to God who gave it. Before he had said, speaking as the world, that our life just disappears and everything to come, he says in chapter 11 and verse 8, is obscure. We don't know what's in the future. But that's him speaking from the world's perspective. Now he says, the spirit returns to God who gave it. Our spirit returns to God. And then he says, vapors, says Qohelet, all is futility. It sounds futile, but that's not his point at all. His point is actually that we have a great God who is actually in control of all these things. Our God who is in control of the wind and the clouds. Our God who is in control of the falling tree. Our God who is in control of our lives, who gives us life so we are knit together in the womb at conception. And when we die, we go to be with him. He says, in all of that, there is a God. And so he tells us, you know, here I am. This is the way it is. I am this great preacher. I'm wise, he says, and I taught the people knowledge. He pondered, sought out, and set in order many proverbs. He searched to find delightful words and truthful, accurate sayings, he says. He reminds us that the words of the wise are like goads. Goads aren't always pleasant, by the way. Goads are like when someone pokes you, or remember in the Olympics there was that German athlete who beat her horse, and the whole world was offended and upset at her for doing that. But goading is not a pleasant experience. She was trying to goad her horse. The words of the wise are like that. Their collective sayings are like firmly affixed nails. They've been given by one shepherd. That's the shepherd of our souls, Yeshua. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. There is no end to the making of many books, and excessive study wearies the flesh. So he's laid it all out. He's saying, pay attention. Here's the final word. When all has been heard, fear God. Keep his commandments, for this applies to all mankind. God will bring every deed into judgment, including everything that is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Our entire lives are to be lived in the light of Yeshua HaMashiach, in the light of our God, who has created us and who has put us on this planet. There are 613 commandments, and we're told to fear God and keep his commandments. That doesn't mean we keep all 613. For some were given to men, some were given to women, some were given to Israel, some were given to the foreigner who lives in the midst. Some of those commandments were given to children, some of those commandments are for parents, some of them are for Levites. Other commandments are for Kohanim, the priests. Many different categories. But for all of us, We have the opportunity to live for God with everything that is within us, with all our heart and with all our soul. We come to the end of the 5 megillot with that. Remember God and live for Him. It's very simple, very straightforward advice after a fairly complicated book. But it is the advice that is epitomized in Yeshua HaMashiach, who was the one who fulfilled all of God's commandments, all that applied to Him. And He is the one who has given His life as a sacrifice for each one of us, and for whom that sacrifice has meaning when we put our faith in Him.